Thank you all very much for coming to Stratford in January. It's amazing, and I hear the numbers are actually good, so, you know, hope springs eternal. That's wonderful. It's not usually this cold at this time of year. It's usually quite warm. But I think that, you know, the cosmos wants to give you a true Canadian experience, a northern experience, and therefore it's a kind of touristic cold that's been here so you can, you know. I love that film. It's just amazing, and I am old enough and been here long enough to know many of those people in the movie, and it's really astounding to breathe in the energy, the sheer innocent joy that's in that world that they were creating, the madness. And there's tons of stories that I could tell you about how unlikely it all was and that it all took place. I'm going to tell you one. Before I do that, I just want to say, in thinking about this keynote, because you've got a busy week and many of you had been, I'm going to try to keep this as brief as possible, but I did want to talk about some of the things that are on my mind recently as I'm planning 2015. We were talking about 16 out in the lobby. We are just about to go into rehearsals on 14. And I think all of us share, you know, a struggle that's also a joy, which is to make this this work vibrant in extremely difficult circumstances. So that's what I'm going to do. But I want to tell you a story about a guy called Bruce Swerdfager, who was in the film. And Bruce was in Ottawa, and not only, you know, did you have Irene Worth and everybody coming from England, obviously, you had actors from across Canada. You couldn't work as an actor in Canada. You had to leave. And suddenly all of these these people who maybe had a bit of radio work, that would have been were going to pick up their roots and come here. And so it was a huge, you know, decision to decide to go ahead with this thing, because all these lives would be changed. And potentially, if it went bankrupt, it would destroy, you know, a lot of jobs, a lot of that, not just here, but also that people had left. So Bruce was working as a typewriter salesman in Ottawa at the Underhill Typewriter Factory. And so he tells his boss he's going to quit the job and go off and do this thing in Stratford. And the boss was like, Bruce, are you crazy? This thing is probably, you know, not going to work if it manages to get through the summer at all. And then what will you do, Bruce? What are you going to do in September for a living? And fortunately, you know, he probably didn't want to lose a good typewriter salesman. So he said, look, Bruce, I will have a job for you when you come back. It'll be something will be waiting for you when this whole crazy festival thing goes belly up. And Bruce, at the 50th season in 2002, said, who would have thought then that the Stratford Festival would outlast the typewriter? I mention that because the very first thing I want to say to you is that going into the theater is not a sensible career choice, right? The first people to point that out to you are probably your parents. You know, they're worried that naturally that you're going to starve to death, or perhaps have to live out a good portion of your life in their basement, you know, being a burden to them in their old age. My own parents, you know, I had really believed when I was young that I was going to become a lawyer, and then I came here and sat in seats we've since removed over there, and it changed my life. And so I went home, and I told my parents that I wasn't going to be a lawyer, I was going to be an actor. And as you can imagine, that went over very, very badly. Sort of dim memories of my mother crossing herself and my father spitting on the ground. All right, I'm exaggerating, but you get the idea. But of course, we don't work in the theater for practical reasons, right? We do it because it's a vocation. This is something that we have to do. And we have to do it why? Because we all sense when we're young, I think, if you go into the theater, that you're at your most complete when you do that work, whether it's directing or acting or writing a play. You sense a sense of all of your talents being used. That's one thing. The other thing is that I think that we all sense, especially in those early years, that when we do theater, we have a chance to change the world. And that, of course, when you're young, is right up there in your must-do list, changing the world. And theater connects so deeply with all of us because, of course, we watch people in front of us acting out very difficult situations, living through them. And engaging in that process helps us understand those situations and also understand one another better. So theater can change us, and by extension, change the world by enhancing our capacity for empathy. It gets us emotionally involved in the fates of the characters that we're watching, even as it's self-evidently artificial form, right? Imagine how artificial this is when you get to watch the audience on the other side of the stage. But it reminds us that it's merely a pretense, and that's very important, because that will provide us with a safe venue in order for us to explore our most intense experiences, to our most dangerous ideas without the risk of harm. And that's what it did for the Greeks, and that's what it can do for us today. So you go into the theater, and you act, and you direct, and maybe you become an artistic director. And as the years go by and you struggle to pay the bills, with your parents' words ringing in your ears, that goal of changing the world begins to take second place to the goal of keeping your company afloat. And that's particularly true here in North America, where government support of the arts, while always appreciated, has never matched what companies in Europe are accustomed to. Governments are, by the way, the other important figures in our lives, and they worry that the course that we've embarked upon may not be the wisest or the best, and so they're not keen to subsidize it either. And as a result, we depend mostly upon the box office, and this has an effect on the work that we do. Now, naturally, we want to connect to audiences. That's a given. But we find ourselves wanting to make that connection in ways that are snug and secure and predictable. We don't want that tricky, unreliable kind of connection that can start heating up and shooting out sparks, you know, the kind that can give a shock or start a fire. So we definitely feel the pressure to entertain, to make safe connections. And if we're smart, we can find ways to push our audiences, push them a bit, even as we beguile them, but we're always conscious of the need not to push too hard, not to do anything too extreme. We grow more inclined, perhaps, to comfort and reassure our audiences than to challenge them. And who could fault us in this terrible economy, with all the institutional responsibilities that we have, if we were just a little bit eager to please? And the work that we do, the work that we once felt made us feel so complete, that once promised to change the world, it becomes perhaps at times a bit of a grind, and perhaps at times we might admit a little insipid. And this doesn't just happen to individual artists or to individual companies. It happens to whole cultures. And over time, the same art form that produced unsparing tragedies and searing dramas and thought-provoking comedies can tend towards banality. After the Greeks came the Romans. And after the great age of Shakespeare, well, in that case, of course, the theaters were forced to close. But when they reopened, they were a very, very different beast. And consider the 19th century, an age of incredible popularity and commercial success for theater artists, with competition from radio and film and television still so much in the future. Theater in the 19th century had never been more central to popular culture. Theaters had never been bigger. Theaters had never been fuller. It was the best of times, and in retrospect, the worst. For not one play written during that entire century between Sheridan and Shaw has survived as a classic. And I don't mean to suggest that, we should all be doing stern, serious work, that we should all be doggedly virtuous, turning up our noses at cakes and ales. There's nothing wrong with joy. There's nothing wrong with fun. There's nothing wrong with frolic. The theater needs all of those things, just as humanity does. But as human beings, as theater goers, we also need to look into our hearts, to see what breathes about our hearts, to find what cause in nature makes these hard hearts. We need to ask ourselves the tough questions, and theater, perhaps more than any other art form, lends itself to that kind of examination. And yes, we are here to entertain people. That's the great strength of theater. But nothing is more entertaining, I think, than a story that is well told, and no story is more interesting than the one that means something to us today. So where do we find that meaning? There can be only one place, I think, and it's at the center of this conference, and that is in the text, in the words themselves. At the center of every text, of any great play is a massively powerful set of ideas, not just one idea, but a series of them. As artists, we look at that text and we try to understand the very heart of it. We ask ourselves, what is the fundamental story of this play? What are the insights that are contained in it about humanity? And above all, why do we need to tell that story? What do these words have to say to us now? And who needs to hear them? Our responsibility is to find genuine answers to those questions and to have the courage to let those answers take us to a place where we might not automatically make everybody happy, where we might provoke controversy, where we might get bad reviews, and where we might risk the wrath of major sponsors. Without totally abandoning common sense, we need to push ourselves to genuinely connect with people, and with their hearts, and with their minds. And of course, there are all too many sensible, practical reasons from convention to economics why we shouldn't do that. There are lots of parental notes of caution being sounded in our heads. But if we don't, then given enough time, we will surely destroy our souls. You know, a couple of years ago, I visited Berlin, where I saw several productions that profoundly impressed me at that time. Among them was an adaptation of Alfred Doblin's novel, Berlin Alexanderplatz. For those of you who haven't read it, it's a novel about an ex-con who comes out of jail, and everything around him seems to be driving him back into prison. And I sat there in the audience, and I was waiting for the play to start, not knowing what was going to expect. And then about 20 people in the audience jumped up around me, and they started, men and women, and started in a very strong, beautiful chorus to speak. Now, my German is, as you may say, a little rostig, which I guess you could translate as non-existent. So it turned out that those people were actually ex-cons. In the play, there were about 21 ex-cons, 4 actors, and they were telling us why in real life they'd gone to jail. And some of them had held up convenience stores. One of them had killed his wife. There were many violent acts that had been committed by those people around us. And then they went up on the stage and they performed the play about how every force that society was making was moving these people back towards prison. It was an incredibly powerful piece of theater, and that production was informed by a real need to tell that particular story to those people at that particular time. A story about how we react to people who have broken our rules, who have offended our notions of justice, of decency, of basic humanity even. How do we deal with such people's presence among us? And here we were in a situation where this question was made all the more real because, of course, they were all around us. And then they were on stage entertaining us. And all the way through that production, it seemed that those questions of what has this person done seemed to be brought front and foremost for us. And that novel became very much alive. On the same trip, I also saw a modern dress production performed without an intermission of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. It can be done, but you can't drink water for about a day before. It was at the Deutsches Theater, but despite that's their national theater, but it was a totally bargain basement production. Like, there was a fold-up table, plastic, whole bunch of booze bottles on it, 4 stacking chairs. And it was completely modern dress. And I mean modern dress now, right? There was no money had been spent on trying to build or source authentic 1960s cocktail dresses or pointy bras. The result was wonderful. By not confining the play to the box of that particular period in which it was written, that production totally released the inherent viciousness of the characters' actions. In its brutality, in its modernity, its unsparing nowness, it made me realize, as no other production of that play I've seen, and I've seen some good ones, as I'm sure you have, I never realized how horrific that situation was as Martha was dry humping the young professor on the ground wearing a short skirt. I shuddered thinking about the furor that would ensue if Martha and George's antics were come to the attention of the university's HR department. You know, these and the other productions I saw on that trip stirred me deeply, made a profound connection with me. And so I was looking forward very much to my second trip to Berlin, which I did in December for about 3 weeks and saw over 14 plays. But my experience this time was a little bit different. And I spent a lot of time on the plane back thinking about why. Some productions still, of course, touch me deeply. There was a beautiful, Talhelm did a beautiful production of Schiller's Maid of Orleans, very spare. There was a beautiful stripped-down production, very vulnerable, of The Seagull. There was a modern play at the Gorky about immigrant youth that was very good, and there was the Schaubühne's Hamlet, which was very insightful, if strongly flavored. It was very good. But in many cases, I felt the stagings that I was seeing, even when they were entertaining, were conventional. And I mean German conventional. Now that, of course, sounds a little bit like a contradiction in terms, because in Europe you sometimes get the sense that, you know, an outre kind of staging is what's expected, and to produce a play without that would be really to incur risk. And I'm not suggesting here for a moment that European theater specifically is in a state of decline and the same pressures, because we all face the same pressures, and things are good and bad depending on when you go and see work. But it's interesting that just when you get used to the landscape of your own backyard, you don't always see it clearly. So it's quite healthy to go and spend some time getting a sense and a reaction to work in another country. And it's interesting when you go to another country and see how their conventions and perhaps routinism was affecting their art, because then you can wake up to the dangers that are inherent in your own work and your own theaters. Now, I saw some wonderful work in Berlin, as I said, this time created by some great artists, but I also saw work that said to me no real need had been found to put on that play in that particular time. And I think that's a danger that we especially face, those of us who produce Shakespeare's plays year after year, and especially the ones that we've done many times before. Too often we find ourselves asking the wrong questions. You know, how are we going to make this Midsummer Night's Dream or this Romeo and Juliet different than the last time we did it? But really the questions we should be asking is, why does anyone need to see my production of this play? What are the ideas deep down in the text that the world needs to hear right now? And once we've discovered why we need to do the play, we can do whatever we want with it aesthetically, as long as our choices align with and support those core ideas that we've identified. A few years ago, I had an experience as I was directing Galati's Grapes of Wrath adaptation, which really stayed with me and informed my vision for the festival when I was appointed. You know, for those of you who have taken a great classic and adapted it for the stage from a novel, you know that it can be a tough challenge, and I think Frank did a fantastic job of it, and Frank was here that year directing Merry Wives. But I was concerned that it would seem like because people had studied this in high school, a bit of a dry process. We spent the first number of days seeing documentaries of people who've lived through the Depression, and those are extremely informative. But what helped us more was to see different documentaries and videos about people, especially in the third world today, who were struggling, workers' rights, people who had learned that they had to stop at a certain point and become violent and turn. And that moment where you are pushed to take action, where me becomes we, was extremely interesting. And then we invited in a group of migrant workers and some union representatives who are trying to organize these workers, most often unsuccessfully. I remember this one man, this union organizer, big guy, breaking down crying because he was talking about a man who had come to him a number of times, a migrant worker, worked at a farm, Leamington, and he was being beaten there. But he didn't dare complain, because if he complained, he would be sent back to Mexico. And he had a family back there he had to raise, and he didn't know what to do. and the union rep didn't know what to tell him to do, and he just started to go. In that moment, everything changed for us as a company. We went from doing another production to having a sense of mission. We realized there was a story here that had to be told clearly, that had to be told with commitment, that we had a responsibility to be heard. And I was happy with some of the things that arrived there, and as I said, the dynamics changed. But something really struck me. I felt, as the year went on, we profoundly missed an opportunity, many opportunities. Because during the course of the spring, as we were rehearsing, I kept on reading papers at lunchtime. One study after another were coming out in 2011 about increasing differences in incomes between rich and poor, in the number of children that live in poverty here in Canada. In the summer, there were dust storms in Texas for the first time since the Depression. And in the fall, the Occupy Wall Street movement started. And I felt in each one of those things was an opportunity for us to connect. We were doing this play, and I think we did it with heart. And I think people were moved who saw the play. I hope so. But we needed to go further. We had a responsibility to somehow not simply leave the play in a cloister, but to take it out and invite people in. And so that really struck me throughout that year. So I'm going to wrap up in 2 minutes here, but I just want to say what this did for me as I began my work as artistic director. What it did was it made me think about both what we program and how we program it. That's the first thing. And the second thing was what we do with it. And so I started something called the Forum. And then the third thing was a sense of exploration, investigation, and re-energizing our batteries, which led me to start something called the Laboratory. So, as David mentioned, we're examining madness this year. Last year, in my first season, we looked at communities divided. Communities divided and what happens to the outsider when that happens. And why do I want to do that? Because I feel that here in Stratford, we have a unique opportunity. We're not in an urban center. People unplug from what they're doing. They come here, sometimes with friends, sometimes with family, and they see a number of plays. And they leave the day-to-day behind, and they immerse themselves in what I hope is a profound experience. There's a lot of theaters that put on 12 to 14 plays in a year. There are very few theaters in the world that do that all at once, where you can see them together. In Shakespeare's plays, you'll often find that he examines an idea almost as if in a sculpture garden. He'll take the idea and examine it in different facets. For instance, in All's Well That Ends Well, just the idea of marriage. There are marriages that are past. There are some that are happening for the wrong reasons. My poor body demands it. There's some that are aspirational. There's some that are being avoided. But you see all of these marriages, old and yet to come, one in light of the other. And in that way, just like the miracle of this stage, where you don't see just simply a two-dimensional slideshow in front of you, but you see bodies in space, you examine ideas. And I felt that's what could happen here with these plays. You would see one in light of the other. And there's a possibility for an examination. So in looking at Communities Divided, we programmed, The Merchant of Venice, which I directed, and I think there's a responsibility for a theater today presenting that play to provide context. And so we produced another play that also begins in Venice and is about racism, Othello. We produced Fiddler on the Roof. We put on Romeo and Juliet because that play is the purest form of Communities Divided because you never know why the ancient grudge breaks out to new mutiny, right? You just know that they're fighting. They've probably forgotten. It doesn't matter. And how like that is that in the world? At the Tom Patterson, we examined the role of faith in Communities Divided, Measure for Measure, Mary Stuart, Gatto. And we put on new plays which are also about people with disabilities and how they are separated from the rest of us. And in this year, with minds pushed to the edge, I wanted to examine the pressures that we all feel in the world that we're in right now. Sometimes those pressures lead to extreme behavior, sometimes to madness, sometimes to metamorphosis. And the pressures that we feel can be driven by all sorts of reasons: love, money, family, our sexuality, war. And so this year we are doing Lear. We're also doing 2 Midsummer Night's Dream. For the first time in our history, we're doing the same play twice. We're doing Midsummer Night's Dream here on the festival stage, the play will be put on as a wedding gift to the marriage of a same-sex couple. And it'll be a group of actors putting on the play for their friends. There'll be gender changes, and it's in a field of grass that'll be here. We also have Peter Sellers doing a very small 4-person chamber Midsummer Night's Dream as well. But we are doing Mother Courage, King John, Antony and Cleopatra. And so there's an opportunity here for an exploration and for a real festival. So this year is different than last year and will be different from next year. And it needn't be dry. There's a lot of fun. There's Crazy for You, which fits in very much in the theme, as well as Man of La Mancha. All right, so one of the reasons I wanted to structure that is because it could give us an opportunity to engage with society. So we take Stratford, Ontario, and bring it right to the heart of North American society. And the forum is part of the effort to do that. We have over 150 events each year, and they range from live performance to comedy nights, late night cabarets, speakers, debates, film screenings, concerts. And it's an opportunity to bring in some people who might never have come here, some leading and very accomplished people in our society, to talk about how the plays relate to them. For instance, on Romeo and Juliet, we had General John de Chastelain, who brokered the Good Friday Accords along with Senator Mitchell in Northern Ireland, and then stayed there for 12 years trying to disarm the rebels, talking about Romeo and Juliet and the comparisons he sees between Romeo and Juliet and the walls and what he experienced in Northern Ireland. This past year, we had Shylock Appeals here on the festival stage. You got a chance another day in court, this time with star litigators and the Chief Justice of the Canadian Supreme Court trying the case. We had many, many different things. And we will have more this coming summer, examining all sorts of issues from teenage suicide to the damage that can be done in war zones. We have an extremely interesting man coming in who works to de-radicalize Islamic youth in Toronto. So there is a chance in the work that we do to not simply leave it on the page, nor even leave it on the stage. Of course, our responsibility is to make this come so alive. But then there's an opportunity for us, because theater matters in this world, that we can take it further. The lab was something I want to start because I feel that there is a danger with a company like ours that examines some of the same work over years with many of the same people in sometimes the same style, that things can get repetitive, and that you think you're good because you're here and you work in the same way and you think that's the way to work. And I think that's a danger we all feel in any institution. And therefore, we've invited in artists who work in different disciplines and from different cultures to come in and do workshops and spend time exploring work here. Often it is movement-based work. Often it is non-text-based work. And for instance, we had a Commedia dell'arte specialist in from Germany this past year who did astounding work with several of Shakespeare's scenes where he never rehearsed the text at all. He simply rehearsed the physical relationships of the scene through exercises. And I can't tell you how alive that text was. It was remarkable. If Stratford were a hospital, I think we'd be a teaching hospital. If we were a university, we'd have research institutes. I would like us to make sure that we're always breaking new ground and pushing back horizons and experimenting and trying new things. So there isn't a staleness or received wisdom that's in the rehearsal hall about this is the way we do it. So in addressing our playbills and looking at how to make the place really a festival, in examining the idea of the forum and engaging in society and reaching out and also broadcasting out these events. Many of the events I mentioned were broadcast across Canada and are available on a website. And then finally, in invigorating our work through the lab, I feel that this re-energizing will lend itself eventually to more committed art, to art that really touches people, and that ultimately will make that genuine connection. And who knows, maybe one heart at a time, it will change the world. Fingers crossed. Okay.